Sergeant Callum Briggs picked up the rifle from Nora Voss's hands, held it at arm's length like something a person had found in a ditch, and said loud enough for the entire assessment bay to hear, "Who authorized this antique for a national evaluation?" Nobody answered. The other candidates studied the floor, the ceiling, the middle distance that soldiers learn to inhabit when they don't want to be seen taking a side. Nora looked at the rifle, her grandfather's Lee-Enfield No. 4, the one he'd carried from Normandy to the Scheldt, the one that had come home in a canvas sleeve smelling of oil and something older than oil, and then she looked at Briggs. She didn't say anything. The quiet she produced was the kind that takes years to learn. Subscribe to this channel. Drop your city in the comments. I want to know how far Nora's story reaches. The van pulled into CFB Petawawa on a Tuesday in late October, the kind of morning where the Ottawa Valley decides to remind you that it has opinions about the cold and intends to share them at length. Nora Voss stepped out last, not because she was slow, because she had learned, in 11 years of service with the Canadian Forces, that how you enter a space tells people everything they need to know about whether you consider yourself a guest in it. She didn't. She was 34, Captain now, though she still answered to the rank the way a person answers to a name they were given rather than one they chose. Her file said combat arms. Her file said decorated. Her file said 3 operational rotations, 2 commendations, and a marksmanship record that the evaluation board had looked at twice before accepting because the numbers suggested a data entry error, and the numbers were not a data entry error. The National Precision Marksmanship Evaluation happened every 3 years. 41 candidates. 8 days. The kind of event that existed at the intersection of tradition and genuine necessity, because a country that trained snipers needed a method of finding out whether its snipers were actually good or whether they had simply been evaluated by people who didn't know the difference. Commander Elise Garneau had designed the current format 15 years ago on the principle that equipment should support skill, not substitute for it. That principle had not made her popular with the procurement offices. It had made her respected everywhere else. Nora had the Lee-Enfield because her grandfather had asked her to take it. That was the whole story, or the beginning of it. He'd pressed it into her hands 2 weeks before his death at 89, in the specific hospital room where men who have lived full lives tend to do their final accounting. He'd said, "You have the eye, Nora. You always had the eye. I want to know it goes somewhere that matters." She hadn't told anyone that. She had simply brought the rifle to the registration desk at CFB Petawawa and set it on the table alongside her forms and watched the logistics corporal's face go through 3 separate expressions before settling on something professionally neutral. Briggs found her at the equipment staging area 2 hours later. He was a tall man with the particular confidence of someone who had been competent long enough to mistake competence for authority, which is a common error and a dangerous one. He was also, by reputation, the finest technical marksman currently active in the Canadian Forces, and he knew this about himself the way people know things they have checked repeatedly and found consistently confirmed. He picked up the Lee-Enfield. He said what he said, and Nora produced her silence. The range master for the evaluation was a master warrant officer named Deschênes, who had been running precision evaluations for 20 years and had developed, over those years, the specific emotional affect of a man who believes he has seen everything. He had the organizational habits of someone for whom surprise was not a professional option. He annotated, he documented. He ran his range with the quiet authority of a person who understood that excellence in administration was what allowed excellence in everything else. He processed Nora's weapon registration without comment. The Lee-Enfield No. 4 met the caliber requirement. It met the action requirement. It met every requirement that Garneau's format specified because Garneau had written the format for exactly this reason, which was that a weapon's age was not a qualification and a weapon's cost was not a score. Deschênes wrote Voss Lane 6 on his clipboard and moved to the next candidate. The candidate's quarters were in a low building that smelled like institutional paint and the particular variety of ambition that collects in spaces where people are competing for something real. Nora found her room at the end of the corridor, which meant she passed 12 other rooms on the way, and 12 other candidates had the opportunity to observe her carrying a rifle case that had a manufacturing date older than most of their parents. One man laughed. Two stared. Several managed the careful neutrality of people who had been trained to conceal reactions they hadn't yet decided were appropriate. The room next to hers belonged to Sergeant Marcus O'Callagh. She determined this from the name card on the door. Army, originally from Nunavut, a man whose file she had read because she read everyone's file. 3 operational tours. Marksmanship record in the 92nd percentile. A commendation from Kandahar that the official language described in the careful, bloodless prose of military documentation, and that people who had been there described considerably differently. She heard him through the wall that evening. Not his words, the walls were thick enough to blur language, but the quality of his voice. He was talking to someone. The tone was unhurried, the specific calm of someone who had nothing to prove and knew it. The evaluation briefing was held at 700 hours the following morning in a room that smelled like old coffee and recent anxiety. Commander Garneau ran it herself, which told Nora something about what Garneau considered important, which was not the briefing itself, but the signal that her presence sent. Garneau was 61, had the posture of someone who had never stopped believing that posture mattered, and looked at the room with the specific attention of a person who was already categorizing. She did not look at Nora differently than she looked at anyone else. Nora noted this because it was unusual, and because unusual things in military settings were rarely accidental. "You're here because someone looked at your record," Garneau said, "and decided the plane ticket was justified. Whether they were right is what the next 8 days will establish." She paused. "This evaluation does not test equipment. If you're relying on your scope to know what you know, you'll find out here that you don't know it." She looked at the room. Questions. Briggs raised his hand from the front row with the particular confidence of someone who doesn't actually have a question but wants to be seen. He asked something about equipment variance in the scoring rubric, and the smile behind the words was subtle enough that only people who knew what to listen for could hear it. The room heard it. Garneau answered without inflection. Then she moved on. After the briefing, as candidates dispersed toward the range for the first qualification phase, a hand caught Nora's arm lightly. She turned. O'Callagh was shorter than she'd expected from the file, built with the specific economy of someone who had never carried extra weight because extra weight had never been available. He had the eyes of a man who had learned to look at things carefully and without hurry. "O'Callagh," he said, "figured someone should introduce themselves like a normal person." She shook his hand. "Voss, I know," he said. "Read your file." He fell into step beside her. The Lee-Enfield, she confirmed. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "My grandmother still has a .303 she used for caribou. Same action, same rifle, more or less." He nodded slowly, with the quality of someone storing information rather than responding to it. They walked to the range together, and behind them she heard the silence of a room recalibrating. The first qualification phase was a standing prone series at distances from 200 to 600 meters, 20 targets, 2 minutes per target, scored on ring value. At these distances, with current equipment and calm conditions, a serious shooter should approach the high 90s. It was designed to establish a baseline and identify anyone whose record had been generous. Nora went prone on lane 6 and took 3 breaths to bring herself to where she needed to be, not to calm down. She wasn't agitated. To arrive. There was a specific quality of presence that her grandfather had spent years trying to explain and had finally given up explaining and simply modeled every morning in the backfield in Manitoba in weather that didn't care about your schedule, teaching her that the rifle didn't shoot. The shooter shot. The rifle is the tool. You are the instrument. He had said it so many times she could hear him, saying it in the way that people who are gone continue to speak through the things they've left behind. She looked through the iron sights. First target, 200 meters. The rear aperture framed it. She breathed out, felt the pause between exhale and inhale, where the body becomes briefly still enough to be trusted, and broke the trigger. Clean. She cycled without checking. Either it was right or it wasn't, and looking back wouldn't change it. On lane 5 to her left, she heard the precise mechanical clicking of Briggs adjusting his scope. High-end glass, the kind of equipment that cost more than some vehicles, the kind that did the calculation for you if you trusted it and let it. His first shot came 4 seconds after hers. The score came back, 9. Her first shot came back, 10, center. She heard someone on the observation platform say something sharply. She kept shooting. Shot 12 was the one that changed the room. 400 meters with iron sights. The front post was the width of a small coin at that distance. There was a right-to-left wind component. She had been cataloging it for 3 minutes, variable, 8 to 12 kilometers per hour, gusting. She waited for the gust to soften, for the specific moment when the air made its choice and paused before the next, and broke the shot in that window. 10, center. The rangemaster, Deschaines, said nothing for 2 seconds. Then quietly, to no one in particular, shot 20, 600 meters. She stood, cleared the weapon, and the scoring officer walked her lane. He looked at the card for a moment longer than the others. Perfect, he said. Just the word. Reading it the way a person reads something they half expected and are still surprised by. Lunch was the particular kind of quiet that follows a morning where something has changed, but no one has decided yet what to name it. Nora carried her tray to a table near the windows. Space opened around her, not hostility. Something more like the instinctive distance people keep from things they haven't finished categorizing. O'Callagh sat across from her without announcement. 2 younger candidates chose nearby seats with the specific indifference of people who have decided not to care about the politics. From the center table, where Briggs held court with a group of candidates who had arranged themselves around him in the way that people arrange themselves around certainty, she could catch fragments. Beginner's luck, she heard. Iron sights at 400 is one thing. Wait until the moving targets. She filed it, not with anger. With the specific attention her grandfather had trained in her, which was that information about what other people believed was useful information even when the belief was wrong. O'Callagh ate for a while without speaking. Then he said, "He's going to be a problem." "He was already a problem," Nora said. "He just didn't have a reason yet. Now he thinks he has one." She looked at her tray. A problem without a reason is ambient. A problem with a reason starts moving. O'Callagh was quiet. Then, "Your grandfather teach you that?" She looked at him. "My grandfather taught me everything worth keeping," she said. "The rest I learned by being the only woman in every room I've ever been in who wasn't there to serve the coffee." He nodded, once, slowly, the nod of a man who recognizes a weight without needing it explained to him. She finished her meal. Then she said without inflection, "Someone went through my kit last night." O'Callagh's fork stopped. "Nothing taken," she said. "Nothing damaged, but moved. I packed to a sequence. The sequence was wrong." She paused. "I'm not reporting it yet." "Why not yet?" "Because right now it's one disturbed kit and nothing I can prove. If I report it, I look like I'm already making excuses. If I wait, and it happens again, I have a pattern." She looked at the window, at the gray October light on the Ottawa Valley. "Whoever did it will do it again because they'll think it worked." O'Callagh was quiet for a long time. Then, "I'll keep my eyes open." "I know," she said. "That's why I told you." The afternoon qualification was a timed acquisition scenario. 12 targets, random sequence, mixed distances, each one visible for 10 seconds before disappearing. The format tested not precision alone, but the quality that separates real marksmen from proficient ones, the ability to trust the first read. In 10 seconds, there was no room for doubt. Doubt lived in the second read, and by then the target was gone. Nora's iron sights found each target inside the first 2 seconds. The calculation that wasn't really a calculation, wind, distance, angle, the accumulated synthesis of 11 years and a childhood spent in Manitoba fields with a patient old man who called it listening, happened below the level of thought, in the part of the brain that thinks in feeling rather than language. By her 9th shot, the observation platform above her had accumulated people. She could hear the footsteps, the low voices. She didn't look up. Looking up was for people who needed to be seen. She needed to shoot. 12 for 12. Deschaines walked the line, stopped at lane 6, looked at the card. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said her name, not her rank, just Voss. And he moved on. Sometimes that's the most complete sentence available. The second act of sabotage came at night. She found it at 2200 when she went to the equipment storage to retrieve a cleaning kit. Her assigned locker was open. Not forced. Opened, which meant a key, which meant access, which meant someone inside the administrative structure. Her ammunition allocation was lighter than it should have been. She counted. 30 rounds missing, not enough to be obvious. Enough, if she didn't catch it, to leave her short for 2 phases. Deniable, precise. The work of someone who understood logistics well enough to know exactly how much to take. She stood in the storage room for a moment and allowed herself the feeling that rose in her chest. Not anger, the precursor to anger. The pressure that builds before the valve opens. Her grandfather had called it the 30-second rule. You get 30 seconds to feel what you feel about the things that aren't fair. Then you put it away and go back to work. She breathed through it. Let it settle. Then she went to Ocalik's door and knocked. He opened it in 15 seconds. Already dressed, or not yet undressed. She told him what she'd found. He listened in the way she had noticed he always listened, without waiting for his turn to speak, which is rarer than it sounds and more valuable than most people realize. How short, he said. 30 rounds. I have surplus from the morning allocation. He looked at her. Then he went to his kit and came back with a sealed box, compatible caliber. He handed it to her without ceremony, the way people pass things when the passing is the point and decoration would diminish it. You're not going to ask questions, she said. Already know the answers, he said. He looked at the corridor behind her. Someone with equipment access did this, which means either they did it themselves or they gave the ability to someone else. Either way, you were the target. He paused. You're not reporting it? Not yet. He held her gaze. Why not? Because if I report it now, before I can prove anything, the story becomes about me making accusations. And if I wait and it happens again, the story becomes about a pattern. She looked at the wall, at the thin concrete that lets sound through in the way walls do when they want to. They'll do it again. They think it worked. Ocalik was quiet. Then he said carefully, not performing care but practicing it, my grandfather came home from Korea. He was the best shot in his unit. His commanding officer's report said adequate under pressure. He paused. Adequate. The man saved 7 men in one firefight, and they wrote adequate. The word arrived in the corridor and took up more space than it seemed like it should. My grandfather's commendation from Normandy got lost, Nora said. That's what the family was told, lost in transfer. He never talked about it. I found out 12 years after he died that it wasn't lost. It was reviewed and set aside because the corroborating officer was wounded and couldn't confirm in writing. She looked at the ammunition box in her hands. He spent 50 years not saying anything about it. He just kept teaching me. Ocalik looked at her for a long moment. Is that why you brought the rifle? She thought about the answer the way she thought about a long shot. Carefully, without hurry, because hurry produces the wrong answer, the same way it produces the wrong shot. I brought the rifle because it's the best rifle I've ever shot, she said. I'm here because this evaluation is invitation only, and I earned the invitation. I'm here because my grandfather spent 20 years teaching me things that deserve to be seen. She looked at the Lee-Enfield case beside her cot. And yes, I'm here because his name deserved to be in a room like this. Since he can't be here, I brought his rifle. Ocalik nodded. The nod of a man who has arrived at full understanding and doesn't need to say so. Get some sleep, he said. Tomorrow is the moving target phase. She walked back to her room with the ammunition, and a feeling she didn't have a precise name for. Something between grief and purpose, the specific compound that forms when you are doing something that matters more than it should have needed to matter, in a world that should have already fixed the thing that made it necessary. She sat on the cot and held the Lee-Enfield across her lap. She ran her thumb along the stock, the worn smooth wood that she associated with her grandfather's hands before she associated it with anything else. There was a repair near the pistol grip, old work, patient and careful, wood filler and linseed oil applied by a man who believed that broken things were worth keeping. He'd said that to her once. Broken things are often stronger at the break than they were before. She lay down. She closed her eyes. Somewhere on the other side of the base, someone was making plans. She allowed herself exactly 30 seconds to be human about it. Then she put it away and went to sleep. The moving target phase was the evaluation's truest test, and everyone in the room at morning briefing understood this without being told. 12 silhouettes appearing at random intervals, random distances, each visible for 8 seconds, moving laterally at speeds that ranged from a walking pace to something faster. 1 shot per target. Miss the window. Score 0 with no recovery. Technology could blood distance. Technology could help with wind. Technology could not feel the speed of a moving silhouette and translate that feel into the right amount of lead. That synthesis lived in the nervous system of a trained shooter, not in the hardware they carried. It was either there or it wasn't, and 8 days of evaluation wouldn't build it. 20 years might. Nora had been learning moving targets since she was 9. Manitoba fields, her grandfather setting shapes in motion along a wire, teaching her the feel of lead the way a musician learns timing. Not from counting, but from repetition until it becomes reflex. She didn't explain this to anyone. She went to her lane and waited. The first silhouette appeared at 500 meters, moving left to right at what she read as jogging pace. She gave it half a body width, felt the timing in her chest, the specific feeling her grandfather had called listening to the shape, and fired. Hit. Second target, 350 meters, faster. Hit. Third, 700 meters. The distance made the movement subtle, which was in some ways harder because subtlety tricked the eye into believing it had more time. She trusted the read she'd made before she was conscious of making it and fired. Hit. Fourth, 900 meters. At 900 with iron sights on a moving target, the mathematics became genuinely hostile. The silhouette was small. The window was 8 seconds. The variables had begun to compound on each other in ways that could not be calculated at the speed the shot required. She breathed. She read the movement. She gave it the lead that felt, in her hands, in her chest, and the accumulated record of 20 years of mornings, like the right amount. Not calculated, known. She fired. The 3 seconds that followed were the longest the range had produced in recent memory. Hit. From the observation deck, Commander Garneau lowered her binoculars. She had been standing at the railing for 40 minutes, watching with the quality of attention that belongs to people who have spent enough time near the edge of human performance to recognize it when it appears, even when it appears in a form they didn't expect. She turned to the officer beside her, Brigadier General Pierre Labelle, the evaluation senior presiding officer, a man with the careful expression of someone who has learned not to react publicly before he's had time to think privately. Pierre, Garneau said. I see it, he said. 900 meters. I see it, Elise. He raised his own binoculars. Below, Nora was already acquiring the next target, settled and unhurried, as if what she'd just done was ordinary. For her, Garneau was beginning to understand it probably was. Where is she from? Labelle asked. Manitoba. Her grandfather was a veteran. Normandy. This pause. What was his name? Voss, Garneau said. Private Arthur Voss. 12th Manitoba Dragoons. There's a commendation in his file that was never completed. Labelle's expression changed very slightly, the way a face changes when a name arrives in an unexpected context. I know that name, he said. Most people don't, Garneau said. That's the problem. Below them, Nora fired again. Hit, and the range made that sound, the collective exhale of a room that has stopped expecting and started witnessing. 12 for 12. When Deschaines walked the line and stopped at lane 6, he looked at the card for a long time. Then he looked at Nora and said nothing, and the nothing was a complete statement. The board was updated at 1700 hours. Candidates moved toward it with the specific casual urgency of people who need to know where they stand but don't want to be seen needing it. Nora was first. Briggs was fourth. He stood in front of the board for 11 seconds without moving. Then he turned and walked out, and the door didn't slam. He closed it with the precise control of a man who was saving something for later. O'Callaghan, standing beside Nora, said quietly, "Fourth place is going to cost all of us something." "I know," she said. "You don't seem concerned." "I'm very concerned. I'm just not going to let the concern into my hands." She looked at the board one more time, her name at the top, the Lee-Enfield leaning against the wall beside her. "Concern in your hands is in your shot. Whatever he's planning stays off the range." O'Callaghan was quiet. Then, "Your grandfather say that?" She looked at him. "He said the only territory you can actually control is the space between your breath and your trigger finger. Everything else you prepare for, and then you let it be what it's going to be." She picked up her rifle and went back to her room. She found the third act at 0600 the following morning. Her daily movement schedule, the printed sheet Deschaines had distributed to all candidates at intake, detailing phase times, lane assignments, and scoring windows for each day, was gone from her desk. The surface beneath where it had been was clean in the specific way of surfaces that have been deliberately cleared. She was dressed and at O'Collick's door in 4 minutes. He opened it before she knocked the second time. "I know," he said. He had 2 printed schedules on his desk. His own copy, weighted with his cleaning kit, as though he'd anticipated someone might want it to disappear, and a spare he'd made the night before and kept inside his jacket. He handed her the spare. The stress fire phase moved up to 0900. The change wasn't announced in the common channel. He looked at her. "Only people who read the update last night know. If you'd shown up at the original time, the phase would have been over." She looked at the paper. Automatic disqualification. Competitor failed to report. Not violence, not confrontation. The clean, deniable precision of someone who understood the rules well enough to turn them into weapons. "He's done this before," she said. O'Collick said carefully, "Men like Briggs don't invent new methods." She buttoned the schedule into her chest pocket and went to shoot. She shot through the stress fire phase, a 300-meter run in full kit followed by 1 shot, elevated heart rate, time pressure, 1 chance. She came off the final obstacle breathing hard and found the firing position and looked through the iron sights and heard her grandfather's voice. "The rifle is the tool. Nora, you are the instrument," and fired at second 5 of 8, dead center. The scoring officer had been running this format for 6 years. He said, "Center," and then, because apparently he couldn't stop himself, "Perfect center." From the recovery area, a sergeant she didn't know said to the man beside him, audibly, "That's the best single stress fire shot I've ever seen on this course." Briggs's shot came back a 7. Not a miss, not a failure. A 7 against her center, in a phase he needed to lead. He knew it before the score arrived. She could see it in how he stood when he stepped back from the position. The stillness of a man absorbing something he'd known was coming and still wasn't ready for. He looked at her across the recovery area, not with the contempt of the first day, something rawer than contempt, something that in a different person, in a better moment, might have become understanding. It didn't become understanding, it hardened. He looked away. At 1400 hours, Garneau called Nora to her office. The office smelled like coffee and the accumulated weight of work done seriously for a long time. Garneau was sitting behind a desk that had 2 files open on it. She gestured to the chair across from her without preamble. "Captain Voss," she said, "how much do you know about what happened to your grandfather's commendation?" The question arrived in the room like something physical. Nora felt it in her sternum, the specific pressure of a thing you've carried for a long time being touched by an unexpected hand. "I know what I found in the family papers," she said carefully. 12 years after he died, a recommendation from his commanding officer, a notation that said the corroborating officer was wounded and unable to confirm. Garneau turned one of the files so Nora could see it across the desk. "Your grandfather's original commendation recommendation," she said, "filed by Captain James Alderton, November 1944, regarding actions during the Scheldt Estuary operations. 31 soldiers whose withdrawal he covered under fire for 4 hours through smoke and mud." Nora looked at her grandfather's name on a form from 1944, Private Arthur Voss, written in a typeface she associated with a world before she existed. "I know about the recommendation," she said. "I know it wasn't completed. It was received," Garneau said, and something in her tone made Nora go still. "By the Brigade Administrative Office in December 1944, it was reviewed and it was set aside." She paused. "The official notation says the corroborating witness could not confirm due to wounds sustained." She looked at Nora directly. What the notation doesn't say is that there was a second notation added in February 1945, in different handwriting. The reason given there was that Private Voss's account of the action, not the officer's account, your grandfather's own account, which he'd given in debriefing, diverged from the official engagement report in ways that the administrative officer found, and this is the word used, inconvenient. The room was very quiet. "He told the truth," Nora said. Her voice was steady. "He told what he saw," Garneau said. The official engagement report had simplified certain details that your grandfather's account complicated. Rather than reconcile the accounts, the commendation recommendation was shelved. She closed the file. It wasn't lost. It was decided against. And then the war moved and the officers rotated, and the paper moved through 7 administrative offices. And by the time anyone looked at it again, the original context was gone, and the second notation was the only thing that remained. Nora said nothing for a long time. Then, "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because of what I've watched you do on this range for 4 days, Garneau said, "and because I think you deserve to know the truth about your grandfather before this evaluation ends." She paused. "And because the truth may matter for what happens next." Nora looked at the closed file. "What happens next?" Garneau was quiet for a moment. "I've been in contact with Veterans Affairs Canada and the Directorate of History and Heritage. There are provisions for reviewing historical commendation recommendations where documentation supports the original filing." She looked at Nora. "The process takes time, but it can be initiated, with advocacy from a senior officer. The weight of it arrives slowly, in layers, the way things settle when they're real." "You would do that," Nora said. "Not quite a question." "What I've seen on this range," Garneau said, and her voice had the quality of a person choosing words with the same precision they'd choose a firing position, "is the most complete marksmanship I have encountered in 30 years in this work. You're doing what your grandfather taught you, with a rifle he carried in a different war, in a room full of people who came here expecting something else." She stopped. "The least I can do is make sure his name ends up in the right file." Nora looked at the desk, at her grandfather's name on a 70-year-old form. She thought about him in the Manitoba cold at 5 in the morning, breath misting, his hands patient over hers on the Lee-Enfield stock. She thought about the repair on the pistol grip, the linseed oil and careful work he'd done without ceremony because he believed that broken things deserved to be kept whole. "Thank you," she said, and this time she meant it in the full sense, not just for the information, but for the act of being seen, for being told the truth about a man whose truth had been kept from her for decades. She stood. Garneau stood. "Captain," Garneau said, "one more thing. There are things happening in this evaluation that go beyond marksmanship. I need you to trust that they're being handled by the people whose job it is." Nora looked at her. "Can you tell me if it's Briggs?" Garneau held her gaze. "I can tell you that Deschaines found your locker key in the administrative storage cabinet, and that from there the investigation moved quickly." She paused. "Trust that it's being handled." Nora walked out of the office and back into the October afternoon, the cold hitting her in the specific, honest way of cold that doesn't care about your circumstances. And she walked to the range to prepare for the afternoon phase. And her pace was exactly what it had always been. Not faster, not slower. Something had shifted in the rhythm of it, though. Some weight she'd carried since the day her grandfather pressed the rifle into her hands and asked her to take it somewhere that mattered had redistributed. Made lighter by being named. Made bearable by becoming something that could be acted on. At 19:30, O'Callagh appeared at the range entrance with the expression of a man who has news and is not certain how to give it. "Briggs," he said, "is confined to quarters." When, an hour ago? Deschaines and 2 investigators. The key log from the administrative building, the ammunition records, and a statement from a corporal who was given access by someone who gave him a reason. He paused. The corporal decided yesterday that what he'd participated in wasn't something he wanted attached to his name. He looked at her. "The investigation is complete." Nora held this information carefully, the way you hold something that is both relief and not relief. "What happens to his scores?" "They stand. The evaluation proceeds." "You're still first." She was quiet for a moment. "He was genuinely good," she said. "That's the thing that doesn't get said. He was a genuinely skilled marksman who used that skill to build an identity, and then when the identity was threatened, he used everything around it to protect it, including things that had nothing to do with skill." She looked at the target frames hanging at distance, patient in the dying October light. "That's a waste. That's a real waste." O'Callagh said nothing. Sometimes the right response is to let a thing be said without answering it. The final day came in clear. The storm that had moved through the valley overnight had taken the ambiguity with it and left behind the specific cleaned quality of air that has been worked over by serious weather. Nora was awake at 4:30, sitting on the edge of her cot with the Enfield across her lap and the citation paper Garneau had given her. A copy, official letterhead, the language of institutional recognition that she had learned to read by finding the human content inside the bureaucratic form. Open on the blanket beside her. The letter was a formal notification of review initiation for the commendation recommendation of Private Arthur James Voss, submitted November 1944 regarding actions during Operation Switchback, the Scheldt Estuary, Belgium. Initiated at the request of Commander Elise Garneau. Expected timeline 60 to 90 days. The reviewing board considered confirmation of the commendation highly probable. She read it 3 times. Her grandfather's full name, Arthur James Voss, which she had not seen on an official document before in her life, existed now in an active file, attached to the recognition that should have come home with him from Belgium, and hadn't, for reasons that had everything to do with a system that had failed him and nothing to do with what he'd earned. 60 to 90 days. He had waited 80 years. He could wait 90 more, and then his name would be in the right place. She folded the letter into her chest pocket and buttoned it closed over everything that mattered and went to the range. The championship challenge was announced at 1400 to the remaining 38 candidates, and the room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when the scale of a thing becomes suddenly clear. Garneau had designed it herself. She called it cumulative precision. 11 shots, each one building on the last, at distances that escalated from 400 meters to 1400 meters. No reset between distances, no opportunity to recalibrate. The shot at 1400 meters was one shot, one chance, and at 1400 meters, with a standard optic in good conditions, an elite marksman had something like a 40% probability of a first-round hit. The physics became genuinely cruel at that distance. Bullet drop, wind drift, the Coriolis effect, atmospheric density compounding on each other until the shot required as much instinct as calculation. With iron sights, Nora heard the distance called. She thought about her grandfather at the Scheldt in November 1944, in mud and rain and smoke, covering a withdrawal for 4 hours, making shots in conditions that the official engagement report had found inconvenient to fully describe. She thought about what he had told her in the hospital room 2 weeks before he died. You have the eye, Nora. You always had the eye. 1400 meters was not impossible. It was just a number. Numbers didn't win. People did. She went to lane 6, same as day 1, and she went prone. And she cleared everything that wasn't the shot. 400 meters, center. She knew it before the call. 500 meters, center. The range began to pay the specific quality of attention that it had been building toward all week. 600 meters. The wind had come up, consistent left to right, 12 kilometers per hour. She adjusted without a dial, without a turret, using only the position of the front post relative to where the target was and where the wind would move the bullet across the distance of flight. Center. 700 meters. Center. 800 meters. She breathed. The front post sat in the aperture, and the aperture held the target, and the wind was steady now, the rhythm of it known to her, the way rhythms become known when you have been listening long enough. Center. 900 meters. The observation deck above her had been filling since the 600-meter shot. She could hear the footsteps accumulating, the low voices, the sound of a room that senses history and doesn't have words for it yet. She didn't look up. She had no need to be seen. She had work to do. Center. 1,000 meters. The target was small enough now that she was using the aperture as her grandfather had taught her to use it in the low light of Manitoba evenings, as a frame, a way of gathering available information and trusting the synthesis of it more than she trusted her ability to see. Center. The range was fully silent, not gradually. It had crossed a threshold around the 1,000-meter mark, and the silence had become absolute, the silence of 38 serious people in a full observation deck, all holding their breath without coordinating it. The silence that precedes something being understood rather than something ending. 1,100 meters, center. 1,200 meters, center. 1,300. She felt the things she had felt in a handful of moments across 11 years of serious work. The specific quality of a moment that knows what it is. The sense that everything prior had been preparation for the next few seconds and that the accounting was about to arrive. She breathed out. In the pause, she fired. 4 seconds of silence from the scoring station. Hit. 1,300 meters. Dead center. The sound from the observation deck was not organized or polite. It was the completely involuntary sound of multiple people failing simultaneously to maintain composure. A compressed burst of genuine human response that lasted 3 seconds and then cut off as people remembered where they were. The cutting off was somehow more eloquent than the sound itself. 1,400 meters. Final shot. The mathematics said the edge of the possible. Her grandfather had taught her that edges were where the work began. She went through her process at the speed the shot required. She felt the wind. She felt the distance in her body, the physical memory of everything she had shot at and learned from, and filed in the place her grandfather had spent 20 years of early mornings building. She felt his hands over hers on the stock. She breathed out. In the pause between breaths, when the body becomes briefly still enough to trust, she broke the trigger. The bullet traveled for just under 2 seconds. The rangemaster would later say he could hear his own heartbeat in those 2 seconds. Then the radio crackled. Hit. Dead center. 1,400 meters. What happened on the observation deck was not the response of a professional military audience maintaining decorum. It was the response of human beings encountering something that had permanently reorganized their understanding of what was possible. Voices, unguarded and genuine. Brigadier General Labelle saying, to no one in particular, in the voice of a man who had stopped trying to be neutral, "Good God." Garneau didn't say anything. She gripped the railing with both hands and looked at the range below, where Nora Voss was clearing her weapon and standing, and becoming aware of the sound above her. And she felt the thing that a person who has spent 30 years in the company of excellence feels rarely enough to notice when it arrives. The specific privilege of being present for something real. She turned to the officer beside her. "Get the ceremony room ready," she said. "Tonight, full dress, every branch present." Nora walked off the range and found O'Callagh waiting at the edge of the staging area, his face more open than she had seen it in 8 days. The careful reserve of 22 years in service completely suspended. He didn't say anything at first. He just looked at her. 1,400 meters, he said finally, "with your grandfather's rifle." "He shot farther," she said. "In worse conditions, for longer." O'Callagh shook his head slowly. "Nora, there are maybe 4 people alive who could do what you just did. And I don't know that any of them could do it the way you did it, on that rifle, after everything this week." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm just the proof that he taught it right," she said. He held her gaze for a long time. Then he said he did. Very quietly. And that was the most complete sentence of the week. The ceremony was held at 1900 in the base's formal assembly room. And by the time the doors opened, every seat was filled, and people were standing along the walls. Word had moved through CFB Petawawa the way word moves on military bases, not through channels but through people, person to person, the story growing as it moved until everyone in the room had heard a version of it and come to witness the ending. Nora stood at the front in dress uniform with the Lee-Enfield in her hands. Deschaines had started to mention ceremony protocol and stopped himself, because some arguments answer themselves. Commander Garneau spoke without notes. 8 days ago, she said, I watched a candidate walk into this evaluation with a rifle that was manufactured when her grandfather was a young man, decline a scope assignment, and proceed to make every shot this evaluation could design, in every condition this week offered, including the final shot of the championship challenge at 1,400 meters. She paused. I've been doing this work for 30 years. I've trained with the finest marksman Canada has produced. I thought I understood the ceiling of what was possible with this kind of work. Another pause. I was wrong about the ceiling. The room said nothing. But this week wasn't about shooting, Garneau said. Shooting is the work. This week was about what produces the shooting, what produces real marksmanship, the kind that functions when everything else has failed, is character, discipline, the willingness to carry something forward on behalf of someone who carried it before you. She looked at Nora. And love. The love of a grandfather for a granddaughter, and a granddaughter for a grandfather, and both of them for a way of knowing the world that deserved to survive. She turned to Brigadier General Labelle, who stepped forward holding a case. He opened it, inside, catching the light of the room and holding it, the citation, a formal document, the commendation that had been reviewed in 1944 and set aside, that had moved through 7 administrative offices and never arrived, that had been initiated for review 72 hours ago, and was now the first physical step in a process that would, in 60 to 90 days, put Private Arthur James Voss of the 12th Manitoba Dragoons formally and irrevocably in the right file. Private Arthur James Voss, Garneau said, and the name arrived in the room with 50 years of waiting behind it, was recommended for this commendation in 1944 for actions at the Scheldt Estuary that covered the withdrawal of 31 soldiers under fire for 4 hours. The recommendation was administratively set aside. That failure belongs to the institution. She paused. Tonight, on behalf of the Canadian Armed Forces, and with the authority of Brigadier General Labelle, I am initiating the formal posthumous review of Private Voss's commendation and presenting its initiation to his next of kin. She looked at Nora. Nora stepped forward. Her eyes were dry. Her hands were steady. She held the Lee-Enfield in her left hand and herself the way her grandfather had taught her to hold herself. Straight, present, committed to the moment without apology. Garneau placed the citation in her right hand. Nora looked at it. Her grandfather's full name on an official document. The name she'd known her whole life, attached now to the recognition that had been owed to him before her parents were born. She felt him in the room, not as invention, not as grief's construction, as the quality of presence that people leave behind in the things they've built and taught and loved. He was in the rifle in her left hand. He was in the citation in her right hand. He was in every shot she'd made this week, and every morning that had preceded every shot, in every lesson that had produced every morning. She pressed the citation against her chest, and she understood fully, in the way that real understanding arrives in the body rather than the mind, that she had not come here to prove anything to anyone who hadn't already decided to see. She had come here to finish what her grandfather started, and she looked out at the room. 38 candidates, officers from every branch, the range staff, Deschaines Okalik near the back, with his arms folded, and his face doing significant work to stay composed, and not entirely succeeding. And in the third row, standing with the others, Sergeant Callum Briggs, who had been permitted to attend because confinement to quarters was not confinement to isolation. He stood straight with his hands at his sides, and his face had the quality she had glimpsed once on the range. A man who has been confronted with the truth of something and has not yet decided whether he can afford to accept it, but is present for it, and the presence itself was a kind of beginning. Their eyes met. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded. Not forgiveness. That was a longer conversation for another day, maybe never. Not absolution. Just acknowledgement that he was there, that he had chosen to come, that the choosing meant something even if it wasn't enough. He looked at the floor. Garneau raised her voice to the room one final time. Private Voss came home from Belgium in 1945 and spent the next 40 years teaching his granddaughter everything he knew about a craft that mattered, she said. He did it without recognition, without the commendation that was owed to him, without complaint, just because the knowledge deserved to survive, and she was there to receive it. She looked at Nora. We are a better institution tonight than we were last week. Not because of what Captain Voss shot, because of what she carried here to shoot it with. The room rose, not on a signal, not as a coordinated response. Chair by chair, in a wave from front to back, each person arriving at the same conclusion through their own route, and the wave moved until every person in the room was standing, and the sound they made together was not applause. It was sustained, collective, genuine. The sound of people recognizing something real. Nora stood at the front of it and held her grandfather's rifle in one hand and his long overdue citation in the other, and she let the sound move through her without trying to manage it or respond to it correctly. She felt him behind her, his hand on her shoulder the way it had been in the Manitoba cold when she was 9 years old, and the Lee-Enfield was nearly as tall as she was, and all the lessons were still ahead of her. She pressed the citation to her chest. Private Arthur James Voss, 12th Manitoba Dragoons, the Scheldt Estuary, November 1944, was finally irrevocably and completely on his way home.